Good morning. For those of you who've joined us, we apologize for the delay. We've had some technical difficulties this morning. Good morning, Michael Walsh and Paul Nantulya. Thank you for joining us this morning. Our discussion. Good morning to our audience. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. We're a non-profit, non-partisan think tank committed to educating the public, our policymakers, and the next generation. This morning, we're going to be talking about Niger and the recent events in Niger, including the coup, and the implications for not only Niger, but the continent, for Africa, and for the rest of us. It's a very interesting time. Some might say we're getting we're hearkening back to the old Cold War. Are there new alliances forming? What are the implications for the United States, Niger's traditional partner, France? And are we entering what some think may be a new era of great power rivalry, similar to the Cold War? So here to discuss this, we have a very distinguished panel. We have the chair of FPRI's Africa Program, Ambassador Charles Ray, who was ambassador to Zimbabwe, ambassador to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. He had a 20-year career, full career in the US military. And now we're very fortunate to have him as part of the FPRI family as the chair of the Africa Program. Our guests today are Paul Nantulya and Michael Walsh, and they're here and will join Ambassador Ray in conversation on this topic. About midway through, as most of you know, we'll start taking questions from the audience. So please put them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Ideally not in the chat because we sometimes miss them, but we'll be checking there too. We will also, and I really encourage you to do this, you'll be getting a feedback form. Please fill that out. I read every single one of those, and sometimes I respond. So I notice people aren't filling them out as often as they used to, but we really do appreciate them and welcome your feedback. Finally, I'd like to thank our supporters and our members of FPRI. We can't do this without them. If you like these kinds of programs and you're not in one of those categories, please do consider becoming a member or a donor. So without further ado, we'll turn over the reins to Ambassador Ray.
Thank you. And we'll start. Technology is wonderful, except when it's not. The situation on the African continent at the moment is not very bright. There's been a string of military takeovers, primarily in Francophone countries and in the Sahel, most recently in Gabon. But the one that is probably most problematic for us here in the U.S. is the one in Niger, which the U.S. government has still not called a coup. In fact, I think at the latest announcement, it's still being labeled an attempted coup. But this poses some real issues for us because of the presence of around 1,000 U.S. military troops in Niger, in Agadez at the drone base there, and the growing tension between Niger and ECOWAS and between Niger and France, which has most recently, in an announcement from President Macron, refused to withdraw French troops from the country, which is setting things up for a bit of a confrontation that could have an impact on U.S. Foreign policy and national security. Our two guests, you can see their bios on our announcement, are experts in the field, and I will let them tell you what this is about and what it portends for the future. And we'll start with Michael Walsh, who is part of is an Africa scholar at both Georgetown University and Howard University in Washington, D.C., and a senior fellow at FPRI, followed by Professor Paul Nantulya from the National Defense University, where he heads their Africa program. And each of them will give us about 2 to 3 minutes of remarks to set the topic up, and we'll discuss it. And then, as you heard, we will entertain the questions from the audience. So, if I might start first with Michael Walsh, and then, as I said, followed by Professor Nantulya. Michael?
Thank you, Ambassador. Since we only have 2 or 3 minutes for remarks, I'll be very quick. So there's some trends here that are happening across the region, which I think are quite important. They've been going on for well over a decade. But the first trend I'll talk about is something that's been going on for a lot longer than a decade, and that's the sort of state of development across the region, which is incredibly low. When we talk about where the region sits in the world, it's always at the bottom. And that is a perennial problem for this region. If you look across the democracy index, you look at the development index, you look at the transformation index, all of these indices that exist in the world, which give us a measure of where countries are politically and economically, this region of the world is at the bottom of those lists. And so that is a extremely problematic issue, regardless of geopolitics. It's a human security issue for the people who live in the region. And it's something that has not been well addressed by anyone, regardless of whether it's a colonial power like France, or it's in the post-colonial world, where we have the issues that we're talking about today. But when we move beyond development, and we start looking at some of the other trends that are happening in the region, which are the more important ones, the ones we talk about all the time, in a foreign relations stance, it's really starts with the issue of Islamic jihadism. It moves into the issue of democratic backsliding and autocratization. It moves into the anti-French sentiment that has spread across the region, the Russian interventionism that's happened across the region, and the U.S. sort of focus on counterterrorism and countering major power and malign influence in the region. So we have these things that are all intersecting in this part of the world. And in the background of this, you're seeing a loss of territory by the sovereign states. You're seeing a lot of frustration in the streets by people who are expressing dissatisfaction with the state of affairs that exist in their home country. And a lot of that's getting redirected to global actors. And we see this when we watch the news, and we see what's happening with the anti-French sentiment, which is making headlines all across Niger right now. But I think when we put this into the context of what's happening, from a US perspective, we really have to think about something much bigger than one country. We always talk about one country. We always talk about Niger, or we talk about Mali, or we talk about Burkina Faso, or maybe we talk about the Sahel. But this is really an African continent issue. We have a significant military presence in Niger. We have a significant military presence in Djibouti. Most Americans know very little about either of those places. And, we've made a huge investment there. And now in one of those places we've made a huge investment, we've seen a coup, which the US was unable to influence the outcome of events in any significant way up to this point, except for that we've prevented this coup from quote unquote succeeding up to this point, to some extent with our partners and other actors at the international level. But the fact that it happened, the fact that we have a significant, multi-million-dollar investment in this region, and it's a significant investment, not just in terms of money, but it's also in time. I mean, you can't build these bases very, very quickly. And so it gets to the question of, what are we doing in Africa writ large? And that's a big question. It's a question for the military. It's a question for our diplomats. It's a question for the National Security Council. But the fact that this coup happened, and the fact that we're having this conversation now, is an important inflection point for us to sit back and say, do we have the right strategy, not just in Niger, not just in the Sahel, but in Africa? And it's not something that's specific to this administration. It's a post-September 11th question. And it's a question that gets raised consistently in the context of Africa. And so I think it's an important question to have. And I think that there's a lot of people working very hard to try to bring this to a resolution that is to some extent in US interests. But that's gonna be a very hard thing to do at this point in time.
Thank you. And before we move on to Paul Nantulya, I'd like to welcome Bob Wekesa from the Africa Center for the Study of the U.S. Welcome, Bob. I guess you, like the rest of us, you had technical problems this morning too. And we will get to you as soon as Paul gives us his input. Paul, you're on. We haven't lost you, have we? Okay, we did. All right. Okay. So, Bob, Paul's having technical difficulties, and so we'll move to you, and hopefully we'll be able to get him back before we're finished.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ray, and thanks, fellow colleague Michael Walsh, and all participants. I would like to enter this discussion from the point of view of looking at the root causes of the problem in Niger, vis-a-vis looking at secondary and tertiary issues. And if we approached it from the point of the famous 3 Ds of development, diplomacy, and defense, it will appear to me the focus has been more on the 2 Ds of diplomacy and defense, with a very little focus on development over the years. And I suppose we seem to be treating more of the symptoms rather than going to the root cause of the problem in Niger and essentially the region at large. My take is that even as we look at matters of security, look at issues such as the bad blood or the feud between the new leader there, Incha, and former president, I think he's former president now, Mohamed Bazoum, although we are still referring to him as elected president. But the situation is that things have moved now. He's essentially former president. There's talk of their having had, differences even in leadership at some point. But I think these are more of symptoms. The security issues, the diplomacy issues seem to be the fuel that is just adding to the fire of underdevelopment. If you look at the GDP of Niger, it's just about 15 billion US dollars. Compare that to just New York alone, which is nearly 2 trillion US dollars in terms of GDP. And so I think the Niger and the region, the Sahel region more broadly, which has faced major challenges related to climate change, loss of livelihoods, a bulging youth profile where young people are just looking for opportunities and so forth. If we look at all those issues, it will suggest that we go back to the drawing board and look at what development will look like so that it is a more lasting solution to stemming the issues of coups that are arising. And in these circumstances, unfortunately, we'll have to lay some blame on France. And it will, because France really has had such a stranglehold on Niger. There's grievances, some of them genuine, of exploitation of the Nigerian people, and particularly in the mineral, and natural resources sector. So to go back to the root cause, it will suggest that we have to rethink the relations between Niger and France, particularly, and there'll be need for a reset of those relations so that the benefits from, or beneficiation is the term we use often, of the resources goes to Nigerian people, particularly uranium, which is where Niger has a big play, with very large, some of the largest reserves in the world. I think to the US perspective, I suppose one has to look at, in the immediate, the fact that some of the reasons for the coup were that the Nigerians do not want, I think the Nigerian military does not want the presence of US military positions in Niger, the bases and so forth. What will that suggest? It will appear that there's a breakdown in relations between the US security installations and the Nigerians. And therefore, it will appear that the presence of Americans, even as Nigerians themselves do not also want the insurgents, the terrorists, Boko Haram, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and so forth, and their affiliates. They also are not seem to be very happy with US military presence. So it will appear that there was a breakdown in relations at that point. And intelligence perhaps would have suggested in advance that a coup was about to happen. But I will say that there's almost a need for a Marshall Plan on the scale under which the US, for instance, and other partners helped out Germany, and even in the 90s, the Eastern Europe states that were emerging from conflict. I don't think that has happened. And so we'll be scratching the surface if we keep on looking at ECOWAS and its involvement in returning the country to civilian rule and so forth, without really going back to the foundational issues, to the root issues of a very poor country where people are basically looking at alternatives to democratic civilian governance. I think those will be my introductory interventions. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, you with us? You're on.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Sorry, I'm on the train back home after spending 27 hours and 2 different transits from Tanzania back to the US. So forgive me for logging in such a shabby way, but I really wanted to be part of this conversation. So the question was just introductory remarks, right, about the situation in Niger. I think I will just say 3 things. The first is, I think it sends a terrible message to the African continent, and perhaps even to other countries in the global south, and perhaps elsewhere, that when you have a problem of a governance nature, that the solution to that problem is to grab power, is to organize your military units and to seize power in the capital. Now, this is supposed to be ancient history in Africa, because African countries have made effort. You know, when we look at the 100 coups that took place from the decade of independence up to the 1990s, there was an effort to stamp this out as a mechanism of acquiring political power, political office, and to try and inculcate values of regular, free, fair, and credible elections, governance, proper governance, electoral management, issues of justice, issues of reconciliation, to address whatever governance or grievances might exist in a country. Now that we have a series of 9 coups that stretch all the way from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Red Sea over the past 18 months, this is really tragic. And I think what has happened in Niger, I think, cannot be excusable under any circumstance. If there's a problem with France, if there's a problem with external powers, these problems, the African continent has developed mechanisms for addressing these problems, and for ensuring that that there's proper constitutional order, where power is in the hands of civilians that are elected through elections that are not manipulated. I think this is the first issue. So I think Niger is really a tragedy for Africa. The second thing that I would say is that it is also a tragedy in terms of international engagement, because clearly international actors have a stake in what happens in Niger. Bob has very, very persuasively articulated some of those issues. Niger has been a very important counter-terrorism partner. It's been a very capable security partner for many countries. You know, France, United States, and so on, as has been mentioned previously. I would also bring in the element of the People's Republic of China. Niger has been a critically important partner for the Belt and Road Initiative, and in fact, the Chinese government has been financing a very ambitious project. It's a 2,000-kilometer oil pipeline that stretches from southern Niger all the way up to Benin. This is an oil pipeline, and there are very many other high-value assets that the Chinese have been investing in that country. And it was very interesting to see China's reaction. Initially, China was very, very quiet. And I think on the 3rd of August, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a terse statement, first of all declaring that that the ousted president, the ousted democratically elected president, Mohamed Bazoum, was a quote-unquote good friend of China, and that his safety and security needed to be paramount, and called on these gentlemen in uniform to ensure his safety and that of his family, and that China was expecting all the different political elements within Niger to resolve that crisis peacefully. That was on August 3rd. Now, a few days ago, the Chinese ambassador to Niger, Ambassador Jin Fang, met with the junta, and he first of all said that China would like to play a mediation role, would like to mediate this crisis in Niger, and to ensure the country can return to some kind of normalcy. But in that same breath, he expressed China's support for the people that have seized power in that country, and said that China would like to continue to invest in projects that are considered to be important by this group of people that has captured power. So I guess the pipeline that we talked about, and there are very many other projects in energy and construction and so on. So basically what that means, I mean, if we read between the lines, we see that China is effectively maneuvering to ensure that its interests can continue to be protected in this new dispensation that seems to be unfolding. Because if you're coming in to say that you're a mediator, it means that there's going to be an even-handed policy in terms of engaging with the ousted democratically elected government, with civil society and other elements within Niger, including the human rights organizations and the population at large, and the elected institutions which have been overthrown, and the gentlemen in uniform. But unless there has been some quiet engagement that Beijing has been participating in with these other elements that I mentioned, one gets the sense that this is a push to really reorganize that interest and to ensure that Chinese activities can continue to be protected under the current dispensation. Number three, where does this become a problem? It becomes a problem because Niger is no longer a member of the African Union and is no longer a member of ECOWAS. Niger has been suspended from the activities of the African Union, and the African Union has announced that it is in a process of putting in place sanctions against these fellows who've seized power in that country, right? So automatically, China is basically now in opposition with African opinion and with the African Union. And I think it should be recalled that when there was a move in the Security Council that was supported by the African members of the non-permanent African members of the Security Council, to impose sanctions on Mali, China and Russia voted against the African position. And African countries were quite annoyed were quite annoyed by that. And that was another situation where you have men in uniform, and it's always men, then it's never women. Men in uniform who decide that they must capture, that they must seize power. And now it's become popular. Okay. So I say that I use China not because I'm trying to put China on the fence, but because China, in my opinion, offers a mirror through which other international partners should be learning important lessons. If the international community fails to call a spade, in other words, this is a power grab that is unacceptable under any circumstances. And because, just because Niger has important security stakes, does not mean that that basic principle that a coup is unacceptable under any circumstances should not be enhanced. So I think it will be tragic if that message is not held firm by other international actors, because China is not the only international actor that has interests that it would like to protect in Niger. If the international community fails in that responsibility, it will send a horrible message to other would-be coup plotters in other African countries, because they will just look at this situation and they will say, well, you can orchestrate a coup and just get off with a slap on the wrist. And then we will see a continuation of this very tragic situation, in my opinion, because the issues that precipitated this power grab in Niger and in Mali and in Burkina Faso and in all these other countries and in Gabon more recently, these same issues exist in other African countries. There are many African countries in East Africa, whether you look at Central Africa, in North Africa, that are coup prone. And there's a whole bench of would-be coup plotters in those countries that are watching very carefully what the international community is doing. So again, I'm not putting China on the spot, but I'm just using China as a mirror so that other international actors can actually assess and learn lessons from what is going on, and also listen very carefully to African public opinion. Because there has been very clear statements that have been issued by human rights organizations, intellectuals from Codesria and other important African spaces of public opinion, that this business of grabbing power, guns, is just unacceptable under any circumstance. It cannot be justified in any way, shape, or form. And really, this is my opinion. I'm very passionate about this, and but really, this is my opinion. This is how I look at this issue.
Well, thank you, all three of you. I want to throw a question out, and I really sort of build on what you just finished saying, Paul, and that is not just the international actors writ large, but one specific international actor I would like to focus on, and that's the United States. We do have a very significant security investment in Niger. I don't remember how many tens of $millions it costs to upgrade the facility at Agadez, but we have this huge investment. We've done training with the Nigerian military in counterterrorism, and we have 1,000 U.S. military on the ground in Niger. Now, under U.S. law, if we say what's happened is a coup, there are certain actions that the U.S. must take, starting with pulling our troops out of the country and closing our other elements are reluctant to do. And my question there is, what kind of signal are we sending to the continent about the validity of U.S. policy toward Africa if we continue to sit on the fence in terms of calling a spade, or a coup a coup? Who would you made yourself pretty clear, Paul, but let's start with Bob. What's your take on that, Bob? How do you think that impacts the U.S. strategy toward Africa? How does our reaction to events in Niger affect that policy?
I think a couple of points there. To start with, I have a sense that because the US has actually pronounced itself in fairly strong terms in terms of opposition to the coup and the coup plotters and the power grab, essentially. It is a long-running policy of the United States, and there are laws and regulatory regimes that uphold that. That is not in question. My sense, however, is and I do agree, actually, let me just say this, with Paul's passionate perspective on the need to adhere to principle. But I would like to be very pragmatic. Look, these coups are not only happening, and in fact, there's a sense in which some people are saying they will continue to happen. So I think a realistic approach is also important, even from the US end of things. It looks like these principles have not worked. If you have so very many coups, particularly a coup in a country that is considered a top ally and a very important nation in a region that is literally falling apart, you have to question why the principles are not working beyond opposition, beyond strategies to bring back democratic rule. And I think that takes me back to the development pillar of the 3Ds. Diplomacy and defense are all good. But I think if you're not investing in matters development to raise people's livelihoods, to persuade even the leaders there that the democratic path is a better path compared to resolving issues through coups, then I think things might not work. And I'll give you perspective. As Paul has actually pointed out, and as Michael was mentioning earlier, there are countries that are actually also prone to the possibility of coups. But if you look at the economies of those countries, I would like to point out, for instance, Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal, which have also had their own fair share of turbulence. They have not necessarily gone the coup way, although they are vulnerable to such possibilities. And you look at their GDPs, their economic performance and so forth, they are a little higher than Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, for example. Senegal is itself in the Sahel region, for example, and it hasn't quite tumbled over. So I think to my extent, it has to be a balancing act where you are investing in matters democracy, supporting the security approaches, but even more important, the development pillar will be critical. I know that, for example, the US had invested through the Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC, in the development of the infrastructure, transport infrastructure. In fact, this was announced during the US-Africa Leaders Summit, where President Bazoum was present. But I think the level of investment in matters economic development have been far lower than investment in matters governance and democracy, where the principles lie. So the principles kind of sit in the air. They do not have a firm base, a firm foundation. And I suppose the solution actually lies, as I suggested, in a very major focus on something to the level of a Marshall Plan, where development actually is the major point of investment around which matters democracy and adherence to principles are founded, are developed, rather than starting with security first, democracy first, and then development follows. And I think there are debates, even theoretically, conceptually, along those sides. But I'm persuaded that in the case of Niger, as long as we have a major level, an economy that is just far lower than even states in this country, in the US, then you have a big problem that will fester for a long time. And therefore, we will be scratching the surface, as it were. Those will be my interventions. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael?
I mean, you'd ask, what does the world think of us on the question of calling something a coup? I started working on this region exactly 20 years ago this summer. And over that 20 years, I've not seen the region improve at all. And so when we look at the situation, there's been a steady stream of evidence that would suggest that we were reaching a point where there was going to be an inflection. If you go back to the Tongo ambush in 2017, you look at what was said, Marielle Harris for CSIS when they do their What to Watch in Sub-Saharan Africa for 2022. She told everyone, she said, her prediction, there was going to be a widening rift between civilian governments and military powers in this region. If you look at the Burkina Faso integrated country strategy that was written, they literally said in the strategy that people are losing faith in democratic institutions. They don't trust them. And so when we look at, the indicators and the warnings that existed and the investments that we've made over 2 decades in the region, and we're at this point where we have a coup belt that extends from Sudan the whole way across the continent. We have Eritrea's off the board. We have Gabon having issues. I mean, you look across the spectrum, this is where we're at right now. And so I think there's 2 questions. There's the immediate question of how do you respond to Niger and what should we be doing about Niger? But there's this bigger question of, how do we address the inability for our interventions in this part of the world to achieve a return on investment that is worthy of the American taxpayer? And, I think this gets to the oversight question. We did have a lot of congressional discussions about what happened in Tongo. But this bigger question of what's happened over the last 20 years in this region and what should we be doing moving forward is a question that needs to be had across all levels of government. And I think that there shouldn't be any sacred cows in this conversation. I think we need to do a full relook, a deep dive, an after action review on where we're at right now. Because, I think when we look at the situation in Niger, in the integrated country strategy for Niger, it literally said that Niger's security forces are an effective partner against regional violence extremist organizations. Niger is at the top of the terrorism index. Burkina Faso is the top terrorism index. When you look at all of this across the board, there's a disconnect between the reality and the way that we perceive the reality, we portray the reality. And we need to, I think, really start to address the reality and think about how do we engage in this region in a way that advances America's national security interests. And that's across the board. That includes the prosperity of the American people, not just, some of the harder security issues that we're talking about. I think the base, when you were asking about how much it was, I mean, we're well over $100 million, in investment there. So, what happens if we lose that? It's not just a question of what happens to that base. It's a question of, really the credibility of the U.S. when, DOD goes to Congress and says we need $100 million for the next base. One of the big risks is always a political risk. When you build a physical footprint overseas and you're putting a posture in a region, we always know that a political risk is one of the major risks to the base's operation. So, we've now failed to manage that political risk. We've had a coup in a place where we have a huge military physical footprint. So there are some questions. And so I'll end with this. I think what we need to do is we need to ensure there's accountability, and we need to ensure that we focus on performance. And so what is the performance of our engagement in this part of the world? And how do we improve that performance moving forward? I wouldn't be as concerned about what the world thinks about us calling something a coup or not calling something a coup. I don't think that's really the most important thing. I think the most important thing is how do we start ensuring our diplomatic missions and our military footprint in this region are performing at a return on investment that the American taxpayer is worthy to demand. And I think that that's something we've struggled with for 2 decades. And I don't have the answer to that question. You know, how do we fix this? But it needs fixed. We can't continue to underperform at the level we're underperforming in this region. And the people of Niger and the people of the rest of the Sahel, you know, the reason that they're losing faith in democratic institutions is they haven't performed either, and they haven't delivered for the people. And so I think to get back to Bob's point about the root causes, you know, if we want to address this issue, people have to start delivering for the people in the region. And that includes their own leaders and includes everyone else who's intervening from outside. And until that happens, there's going to continue to be a huge risk of instability and further instability across the region.
Thank you. Before we go to audience Q&A, Paul, do you have any last words on that issue?
Yes, I think you know I would like to you know agree with Michael. I spent over a month in Tanzania, and which is where I'm coming from now, and there was a very, very healthy debate in Tanzania. Tanzania is a country that has historically been very, very anti-coup in Africa, and that very, very deep aversion to military coups is something that continues to characterize Tanzanian political discourse. So I went there in Dar es Salaam, and I was just engulfed. I was quite amazed as to the discussions that were taking place in that country about the coups that had happened in Niger, in other West African countries, and also Gabon. And I took away two things from those discussions at the University of Dar es Salaam and other institutions, and serious concern that is being raised about the potential that that more coups might actually happen among Tanzania's neighbors, and that is something that really, really worries the Tanzanian establishment. And the two things I took away was cynicism and moral authority. Let me begin with cynicism. The conversations that were taking place there were basically along. I would basically summarize them as follows: that if international partners, in the case of Niger, in the case of all these countries that have conducted coups, okay, if international actors fail to do the right thing, come very, very strongly and with a clear position and a clear policy that power grabs are unacceptable, right, by these men in uniform, that they are unacceptable, and that even when you have important security stakes, that principle must continue to be advanced, and the necessary actions must be taken to ensure that such assistance does not continue, because now that assistance actually becomes harmful to the country concerned. Then what you're going to have, and this is what the Tanzanians are saying. This is what the Tanzanians are saying. Then the public becomes very cynical about messages that democracy is a value, and that good governance, and these are things that are worth protecting and worth defending. People become very cynical about that. So I think that's the first danger. Then on the issue of moral authority, right? That if development partners fail to do the right thing again, with these situations where men are taking it upon themselves to seize power in this fashion. If a country like China, as I explained earlier, takes a position that shifts from calling a coup what it is, which is a power grab, and then suddenly you're shifting slowly to working with the people that have effected this kind of power grab in order to protect your interest. Then what the Tanzanians were saying in this discussion that I close quarters, then they'll say, well, then what do other development partners have to criticize the Chinese for being immoral and for being unethical? What moral points that I had raised earlier, and also to support what Michael had been saying, and also the earlier points that that Bob had noted. It's cynicism and moral authority established proper bonds of respect. So I think that's what I would say before.
Thank you. And now I'd like to turn the mic over to our president, Carol Raleigh-Flynn, to moderate the questions from our audience.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ray, and thank you to our panelists. What a fascinating discussion. We are almost out of time. We have about 7 minutes. And because we got started late, for our panelists who can stay on, I think we'll go another 5, max 10 minutes over. We'll understand the audience can't stay necessarily for all that. If you can, please do, but we'll be recording it, so you'll be able to watch it later for those of you who missed it. So we have a lot of really good questions. I'm going to ask our panelists to please keep your answers short and concise so we can get to as many as we can. We have an initial question. Can we leverage the importance and connections of commodities multinational firms to temper and channel coup leaders? So basically, can we leverage private sector and the big firms that are operating, especially the multinationals? Who would like to take that question? Okay, please go ahead, Bob.
Okay, no, I think my response to this is starting with the principle which we actually had loud and clear during the US-Africa Leaders Summit in December, which is that if you want to promote American interests, corporate or otherwise, you also have to look at the African interests. So where do those interests meet? And I suppose the private sector, corporate diplomacy, in fact, with real action is one of the ways that one of the tools that can go into a Marshall Plan, so that American private sector succeeds, and therefore the American economy does well, but also Nigerian economy, entrepreneurs, government also succeeds. I suppose therefore the policy tools, policy approaches will have to look at balancing acts in which there is support for companies involved, for example, in solar energy, which is plenty in Nigeria, uranium mining, oil, and so forth, but that there is a very major focus on benefits accruing to Nigerians. And therefore, American ambassadors serving in, diplomats more broadly, State Department, US Trade Representative, and all these US agencies will have to focus on how do American businesses succeed in Niger rather, but also ensure that this economy that is only 14, about 15 billion US dollars GDP rises even just marginally to about 20 billion. And therefore, we use that as a route towards governance issues such as democracy and so forth. I will propose that as an approach rather than really being, and I'm almost talking like as a devil's advocate for the junta, for example, rather than starting saying respect democracy and human rights, but then development will follow. Let's use the route of let's start with development as an encouragement for you to take on board democracy and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. We have we have some very interesting questions and comments around this idea that there was strong public support for the juntas in Niger as well as Mali and Burkina Faso. And we have comment of a guest, and I'd like at least one of you to comment on this, which is that, and I'll just quote from this, I believe that Marshall Plan-like initiatives for Sahel would go a long way to addressing insecurity issues, but the West is not willing to make that investment in Africa. Mr. Wekesa suggested that the junta in Niger reflected popular demands, but that's not clear. It wasn't a ground-up insurrection. It appears to have been a politically orchestrated coup that seems to have backfired on its political planners. Then I'm going to jump down in this comment. The problem, which is all too apparent, is that the traditional political class in the Sahel has lost credibility. Suggestions are that Bazoum was removed precisely because he was trying to dismantle cronyism and patronage in the political system. Who would like to take a stab at that? And again, quick answers.
So, I mean, I can just interject something really quick here. So when we talk about whether there's popular support or not, I mean, we mix up anti-French sentiment with popular support for the coup, I think, in the coverage. I think it's unclear whether it's popular support for the coup, but there is certainly considerable anti-French sentiment within Niger. And so I think you have to draw a distinction between those two things. I think that's a very important thing. With respect to the Marshall Plan comment, I completely agree. I do not see any daylight for a Marshall Plan in the Sahel. It's a landlocked part of the world, and we've never seen that being demonstrated in the past. And so I think that that's not something that's really a viable option unless, the American leadership team wants to step in and say, we're going to do something completely different. But that would be very difficult to sell, especially in an election year, to the American people.
Another question, and these are the words of the questioner. How did France maintain a stranglehold on Niger? And I'll defer to our panel whether it was actually a stranglehold, but how did they maintain their influence? Why don't we go to Bob Wekesa on this, and then we'll take Paul too if he can.
No, I think pretty quick is that France is a former colonial power, but if you look at its approach to Africa, vis-a-vis compared to Britain, the UK, there's I will advise that anybody who wants to look at French stranglehold on that part of the world looks at the whole concept of Franc-Afrique, which is the idea that France and its former colonies are conjoined at all levels, culturally, economically. In fact, if you just look at the use of the Central Africa franc as a currency, linkages to the French treasury and so forth. And I think I'll use this opportunity to, and of course, when you look at recent coups, none of those have happened really in former Portuguese or Spanish or Anglophone countries, even though they might be areas of vulnerability. And so that suggests that the model of engagement between France and its former colonies is problematic. We could go into the details, but I don't think we have the time. But I suppose that's the point of analysis. There have been some suggestions that the US particularly needs to decouple from linkages with its ally, France, where Niger is concerned. I would suggest, in fact, that a major conference on the relations between these countries and international partners will be perhaps a good starting point, led by ECOWAS. Thank you. Those are my very brief comments. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Bob. Paul, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think what I would add, I think Bob has said it all. What I would like to address is the argument that people welcomed these coups and so on. I mean, I think if you look at the history of African coups, and actually if you look at coups even in Latin America, there's always coups always take place in a situation where the public already feels a sense of fatigue with the governance regime and also a sense of dissatisfaction. And so you're always going to have that, right? But my question is, I would like anybody on this forum or anywhere else to give me evidence of a coup that resulted in a comprehensive uh, package of measures that were able to put the countries where these coups happened back on a democratic trajectory and on a path of constitutional governance. I'm still looking for an example of a coup that actually led to that. I mean, I'm thinking of Idi Amin. I'm thinking of all these coups that have happened all over the place. I think the empirical evidence shows, regardless of what happens after the immediate occurrence of a coup, the empirical evidence shows that uh, uh, the military is not trained to govern. It is not trained to govern, and it is not trained to handle complex issues of bad governance and returning countries to constitutional rule. The military, unfortunately, has got a terrible track record when it comes to that. So I think that's what I would say to the notion that these coups have been welcomed, and therefore the
Paul, I think
Paul.
that's a. I think Paul is frozen on my screen. I'm not sure if he's on others. I'm gonna throw that question to you, Bob or Michael. Do you know an instance of a military coup that has resulted in better governance, short-term or long-term, particularly long-term? And I would expand it to anywhere in Africa or elsewhere in the world. Michael, Bob?
Okay, I think let me go first. Michael, sorry, Michael, I went ahead of you on that, but a very quick one. I do totally agree with Paul that coups are messy, coups are terrible, coups are anti-democratic. They just are not the way we should be governing. In fact, that they are happening in the 21st century is just mind-boggling. However, I wish that we do recognize that they are happening, and therefore, even as we kind of discuss the horrific nature, the anti-liberal and terrible consequences, and the unsustainability of coups as avenues for resolving problems, we look at the fact, we look the problem in the eye and recognize that they are happening, and they're happening in many countries of the African continent. And there's even talk of countries such as Equatorial Guinea and so forth also being vulnerable. So I think the major point now is to recognize that they're happening and move towards looking for solutions to those, and actually looking for long-term development. Long-term solutions must have a very major infusion of economic renewal, economic renaissance on the continent. Thank you.
We do have one comment from a guest who says an example of a coup that opened the path to democracy was Mali in March 1991. Michael, do you have anything to add?
I mean, it's a question of semantics, because usually if a coup turns into something good, we call it a revolution in retrospect, and we stop calling it a coup. So, so I mean, the Romanian Revolution is a good example of that, right? So, so we tend to do that. So yeah, I'm not a coup historian, so I won't delve into that space. But I will say that what's happening in Conarchy right now, and it gets to the question of how did the French maintain power in this region? I mean, you have a legionnaire who's leading that coup there, and in his argument and the argument of the government was that was going to lead to democratic restoration and rehabilitation for that country, and that hasn't turned out to be the case. But there was support for that coup within the country. And so, it's much easier when you're a military to be able to succeed in achieving a coup than to achieve a democratic reformation from a coup. So it's a much harder thing to do in practice.
Okay, we are now over time, but I'd like to thank our panelists and Ambassador Ray for a really, really interesting conversation. Again, reminder, give us your feedback, and this will be on Zoom afterwards. It'll be on our FPRI YouTube channel. So thank you all for coming. Thank you again for your support for FPRI. Really interesting discussion.